This morning's webinar, Preparing a Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, is part of today's 2020 Virtual Compliance Assistance Conference. These webinars have occurred over a 3-week period from September 21st through today, October 8th. Please visit our conference webpage for more information about sessions you might have missed and to register for our last session this afternoon. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items to help you participate during this morning's session. On this slide here, you will see a screenshot of an example attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your computer desktop in the upper right-hand corner. For this webinar, you are listening in using your computer audio. If you are having sound issues, please try refreshing your browser. If that does not work, try logging out and logging back into this session. If that does not work, please check your computer audio settings. Please feel free to submit questions to today's presenter by typing them into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send your questions in at any time during the presentation, and we will address them during the Q&A portion at the end. If we do not have time to answer your question during the Q&A portion, we will reach out to you via email after today's webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording in a follow-up email along with a session survey. The session survey will also appear once this webinar ends. We value your feedback and would greatly appreciate it if you could let us know how we are doing and let us know if there is anything we can do to further assist you. A copy of the presentation slides are also available in the handout section of the attendee interface. A certificate of attendance will also be included in that follow-up email about a day or so after this session. This session is approved for 1 hour of registered sanitarian and training credit. If you did not submit your RS or SIT number in the CEU ID number box when registering, please make sure you provide us with your number through the Q&A feature. This session is also approved for 1 contact hour of wastewater operator certification. To receive credit, you must attend this full session, and the session must be the primary window open on your screen for more than 90% of the time. You must also participate in all live chats or polls. If you did not submit your operator core person ID number in the CEU ID number box when registering, please make sure you provide us with your number through the Q&A feature. This session is also approved for 1 VMP hour towards annual education requirements for C and DD certified operators. Submit your session attendance certificate with your certified operator application or renewal form to Ohio EPA's C and DD operator certification program. Attendees seeking American Planning Association credit may do so through APA's self-reporting option. Log into your My APA account and select the self-reported credits option to receive credit. If you are seeking other CEUs, please refer to our agenda available on the conference landing page at epa.ohio.gov/compliance_conference or visit Ohio EPA's webpage at epa.ohio.gov and click on the 2020 Virtual Compliance Assistance Conference scrolling banner at the top of the page. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to today's presenter, Tamara Gerard from Ohio EPA's Office of Compliance Assistance and Pollution Prevention. Tamara, take it away.
Hi, good morning, everybody, and welcome. And thank you very much for joining us on our last day of the Virtual Compliance Assistance Conference, and particularly thank you for joining me on this virtual session of preparing a stormwater pollution prevention plan, otherwise known as a SWIP, under the NPDES Industrial Stormwater Permit Program. And we're going to start this session a little bit differently. We're actually going to start with a poll just to kind of give me a sense of where everybody is in terms of their SWIP experience. So once the poll has been launched, if you can let us know what your experience is in developing a SWIP. Do you have experience developing a SWIP? Do you not have experience developing a SWIP? Or you're saying, SWIP? I don't even know what a SWIP is. So once the poll is launched, if you could please make your selections.
Okay, the poll is now launched. Please select your response and click submit. It looks like the majority of you have responded. Those of you who have not yet responded, please go ahead and submit your responses now, and we will close the poll in a few moments. The poll is now closed, and we will share the results with everyone.
Okay, so it looks like we have, mixed audience here, which is great. Looks like the majority of you do have experience in developing a SWIP. Some of you have none, and there's still some saying SWIP. I need SWIP 101. I'm not sure what a SWIP is. Okay, and that's fine because I think this session there's a little bit for everybody. If you've developed a SWIP before, I think the session's going to be a good review of what the basic elements of our SWIP are. You learn some insider tips on what makes a good SWIP. So you can then go back and take a look at the document you've developed and kind of look at it with a fresh set of eyes. If you haven't developed a SWIP before, this will definitely be a really good primer to help you understand what a SWIP is, what the purpose of the SWIP is, what are the basic components of it, how to go about putting it all together. You'll learn some insider tips and tricks on making a good SWIP, and equally as important, some common mistakes and how to avoid them. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. What is a SWIP? So if you've been asked to come under the Industrial Stormwater Permit Program, that means that you have activities or operations, industrial activities or operations that are exposed to stormwater. And the permit's going to make you do something about that, particularly take steps to reduce or eliminate those impacts to the extent that you can. And that's really where your SWIP comes in. I kind of look at the SWIP as your facility's stormwater playbook. It's a written document that's basically going to be everything stormwater and compliance with that for your facility. Your SWIP is going to talk about what happens to stormwater on your site, where does it flow, where does it discharge, what are your drainage structures, things like that. It's going to look at what your activities or operations are that can impact stormwater. And it's also going to look at the steps, control measures or best management practices that you're going to put in place to kind of reduce or eliminate those impacts. And it's also going to talk about how you're going to implement your SWIP, how you're going to comply with it, and how you're going to comply with the Industrial Stormwater Permit Program. The SWIP is a requirement of the permit, no exceptions. So if you're asked to come under the permit, you need to develop your SWIP. And because the SWIP really is the document that's your plan for stormwater and control of impacts, you really need to have that developed and written before you go ahead and apply for the permit by submitting your notice of intent or NOI under the permit. Okay, so that seems like a lot of information, but like anything else, any big project, it's good to go in with an action plan. And I think when you read through the Industrial Stormwater Permit, at least when I read through it, you can see the information that's needed in order to comply with the permit and prepare the SWIP. And to me, the information kind of chunks itself out into some major action steps. And I think that's a good way to go about tackling the SWIP. If you look at the permit, first of all, you have to have a team. You have to have some basic level of a team and some organization. That's your planning and organizational step. You have to gather a lot of information about your facility, your stormwater, your drainage, your discharge locations, your pollutants, things like that. That's the assessment step. And then based on that information, it's going to give you an idea of what the actions are that you're going to have to take to eliminate or reduce those impacts. That's your control measures or your best management practices or BMP identification step of pulling together your SWIP. And then it's going to get pulled all together and implemented. And your SWIP also talks about how you're going to implement your SWIP, comply with it, and comply with the Industrial Stormwater Permit through, evaluation, monitoring, and record keeping. So those are kind of, the steps and kind of a basic action plan that you can take to help get started and pull this information together. And let's take a closer look at each one of these SWIP steps. Starting with planning and organization. Now, the first start is doing your homework and pulling everything together, and that really starts with putting your SWIP team together. So in order to pull together a good SWIP team, you have to have a good understanding of why you need the team and what their purpose is. And if your SWIP itself is kind of like your playbook, then your SWIP team are your players. They're your boots on the ground. They're the ones that are going to help you pull the information together to understand what's happening to stormwater on your site, where is it going, how is it getting impacted, the measures you're going to take, and all that information. Your team's actually going to help you write and develop the SWIP. Your team is the one who's going to help you implement the things that the SWIP asks you to implement, your control measures, your monitoring, your inspection, and things of that nature. So they're really your boots on the ground to help ensure your compliance with the SWIP and your compliance with the permit. And in addition to helping you write the SWIP, your team's also going to help you periodically review it and make any revisions and modifications that need to happen. So that's a lot, and that's kind of a big step and a lot of tasks. So it's good to really put some thought into this part of the process and pull together a really strong team. So some things that you can think about when you're pulling together your team. Obviously, what happens to stormwater in your site is specific to your facility and your conditions and your activities. And so your SWIP is specific to your facility. So you really want to make sure you have people on your team that know your site. They're familiar with their facility. They're going to be the people that are best able to help you pull together that facility specific information that you're going to need to put together a good SWIP and to be in compliance. Because everything is really facility specific, not only do you want to have people that are familiar with your site, but people that are on your site and available on a regular basis, because your team's going to be the one that's going to help you do your inspections, your monitoring, your record keeping. So it's important that they're there with some frequency. And obviously, you want to have people that have some basic knowledge about stormwater and control measures, or people that can be trained, to that basic level of knowledge. So your SWIP is going to be as strong as your team. So I would encourage everybody to really take time, think about the best people for this task, and put together a strong SWIP team. It'll help you in the whole process. Okay, so as we go through these different parts of a SWIP and how to put it together, like I said, the SWIP is a written document where everything's included. So obviously you're going to include information about your SWIP team within your written SWIP document. So you're definitely going to want to put in the SWIP, who's your team, identify them by name, what's their title, what's their role with your facility, what is their role in terms of the SWIP and your stormwater planning and implementation. And you want to make sure that their contact information is in there. And a little insider SWIP tip, you want to write your SWIP, but your team also should have access to your SWIP at any time, because they're your boots on the ground for pulling all this together and implementing it. So you want to make sure that they have access to the SWIP. Okay, again, this information has to be in your written document. There is not one single way to do it. Here's an example from a SWIP. Where you see, what you don't want to do is just put people's names and phone numbers. This should be a living, usable document that really people should be able to pick it up and know who's on your team, who's doing what. If somebody has a question about training, who's the person to go to. So you'll see in this example, not only are the SWIP team members' names listed, you see their titles or roles within the company, their access, emergency, and work numbers. But more importantly, you see very detailed what their job is. What is their role on the SWIP team? Who's doing sampling? Who's doing record keeping? Who's doing training? So again, take the time to think this through, develop a good team, and identify clear roles. And try to match people's skills to the roles to the extent you can. So it all goes into forming a really strong SWIP team. Okay, common mistakes that facilities can make when putting their team together. Number one, they don't put a team together at all. So again, this is kind of a big undertaking, and your permit compliance really hinges a lot on having a good SWIP pulled together. And that requires a really strong SWIP team. So take the time, pull a good SWIP team together. Make sure, like I said before, that you have clearly defined roles, and that your team members know what their roles are, and that they're properly trained and they have the information they need to carry out those roles to the best of their ability. Make sure your team members have access to the SWIP. And again, you'll hear me say several times throughout this presentation that the SWIP really needs to be a living, breathing document. It changes as your facility changes. So if you have changes in your SWIP team, make changes to your SWIP. Make sure your contact information for your team members and the roles and whatnot is up to date. And again, you want to make sure your team has all the knowledge and training that they need to carry out their tasks. So you want to meet regularly, at a minimum once a year. But in reality, meeting more regularly, I think, will only lead to a stronger team and more improved compliance. Okay, so you've done the initial planning and organization part of it. You've pulled your team together. Now your team's going to get to work. You're at the assessment stage. And this is really where you're pulling the information together to tell the stormwater story of your facility. Where does stormwater go? Where does it discharge? Do you know all your drainage structures and where they discharge to? What are your activities that can impact stormwater? So everything kind of, as you go through the stages, everything kind of builds on itself. So again, take the time with this assessment stage. It can be overwhelming because there's a lot of information to pull together, but there are some things to consider that can maybe make this process a little bit easier and more streamlined for you. A good thing to remember is no matter what stage of the SWIP you are, start where you are. Look at what information you already have. If you have facility maps and drainage maps, that's a great place to start. Take a look at that. No sense in reinventing the wheel if you already have some of that information pulled together. But if you're looking at existing information, make sure you verify. Make sure it's up to date. Make sure you know that, in fact, that is where the drainage structure discharges to. But start where you are and always validate what you have. One of very, very good ways to get information in this assessment stage is actually walking your site, observing your site. You're going to want to do this during a storm event. Obviously, it'll give you key information about where water flows on your site and where it leaves your site and where it could be impacted. But you also want to do a dry weather walkthrough. So these two together are both very powerful, pieces of action steps you can take to get that information. And as you're walking through, write down everything you see. Okay, take notes. You can always sort through it later. But you're going to want to identify those industrial activities and operations on your site, and then make note of those industrial activities and operations. Are they exposed to stormwater? Again, do walkthroughs of your site, talk to staff, get their feedback about activities and operations. Really take your time in pulling this information together. A good tip you might want to consider is, as you're doing this, take along a little handheld GPS or even the Compass app on most smartphones. As you're going through, gather all the information about where things might be located. That will help you when you're going to actually write this down in your written SWIP document. And it's definitely going to help when you get to the point where you're putting all this information together on your maps. You'll already have the information about where it is and real good detailed descriptions. So just some more insider tips and tricks to help make this process a little more streamlined for you. One of the other things to consider, and this is very often missed, and it's a common violation under the permit, is people know that you have to take a look at stormwater and where it flows and where it discharges to, but a lot of people forget you also have to look at those non-stormwater discharges. So in addition to understanding stormwater, you have to assess for those non-stormwater discharges. So there's different ways you can do this. And again, that's where that dry weather walkthrough really is helpful in looking at any discharges that obviously are not stormwater. You can also use smoke testing, dye testing, cameras, other measures to try to look at all your drainage structures and identify those non-stormwater discharges. If you have any of those non-stormwater discharges that are not allowed under the permit, you need to take immediate action to eliminate those or come under another NPDES permit for those discharges. And it's important that you do this, not only that you do this, but this is something else that you need to make sure gets incorporated in your written SWIP document. And in your document, you're going to want to make note of when you did the assessment, who did it, how you did it. Did you find any illicit discharges? If so, what are the steps you took to eliminate those or put them under permit? And you need to make sure you document that and keep that with your SWIP. Again, I point this out because it is often missed and it's a common violation under the permit, and a common SWIP violation is that this non-stormwater discharge is not included. So pay particular attention to that. And as you're going through your assessment stage, make sure you're looking for those non-stormwater discharges as well. Okay, so in addition to understanding what happens to stormwater, because this is, the permit that you're controlling those impacts of stormwater, you need to know what those impacts are. So you need to gather information about your activities and operations that could impact stormwater and identify what the particular pollutants are. So again, start from where you are, start from what you know, look at the information that you've gathered during your walkthroughs about your activities and your operations, information you got from talking to staff, and you're going to want to make a list of all your industrial activities and operations and those that are exposed to stormwater and what those pollutants could be. Again, it has to be facility specific, so start from what you know, but there are some resources that can help. One resource is the US EPA has a series of industrial stormwater fact sheets done by industry, and you'll see an example here on your screen. This is one for fabricated metal products. And in those fact sheets, they call out particular industrial activities and operations that a lot of facilities in that industry have, but also what are the pollutants that are most often associated with those activities. And additionally, they talk about control measures or BMPs that a lot of facilities can put into place to control that. So use your facility information, but also take advantage of the resources that are there to help you in this process. Okay, and again, just like everything else we've been talking about, this information has to be put in your written SWIP document. There is not one single way to do it. You just want to make sure that when you put it together, it's comprehensive and it makes sense for your facility. You are writing, I guess, a type of regulatory document, but just remember, you're not writing this per se for the regulators, you're writing this for yourself. So it needs to be descriptive enough that somebody can pick up your SWIP and know what's going on at your site, know your pollutant sources, know your stormwater impacts, know your drainage, but you don't want to put information in there that's not necessary or makes it difficult to get the basic information out. So remember, you're writing a quasi-regulatory document, but make sure it makes sense for your facility, make sure it's usable. And this is just one example, and it looks like this one is from a auto salvage yard where you can see they called out the different activities that they have. They made mention, is this, what are the pollutants associated with this activity? Is it something that's exposed to stormwater? And if so, not only is it exposed, what are the pollutants, but what outfall or drainage area can be impacted? So again, just another example of how something like this can be written up in the written SWIP document. Common mistakes that people can make when they're in this assessment phase. They don't take the time to do a comprehensive job. Now remember, as we're going through, these things kind of build on one another. So the information you're getting on the assessment stage, you're understanding what happens with stormwater and your pollutants, and that's going to inform what kind of control measures or BMPs you put in place. So everything builds on itself. So it's really important to take the time needed to do a really comprehensive job, and it needs to be facility specific. There are those resources out there like the US EPA industrial fact sheets that are wonderful resources. Use them as a guide, but make sure, don't just use that. Make sure what you're putting in there is facility specific and it makes sense. You want to make sure you talk about all your outfalls, your drainage structures, and again, I want to reiterate, don't forget to include those non-stormwater discharges in your assessment phase. Okay, it's poll time again. Okay. So here you see a couple examples of some, common things you might find in a facility. So when we were just talking about assessing your site and assessing the pollutant sources, once the poll is launched, if you can indicate which one you think is a potential stormwater pollutant source that you want to consider in your assessment and talk about in your SWIP. So choice A, we have an outside salt storage shed. B is an employee parking area. And C, we have some material storage that's located inside a building. So once the poll is launched, if you could go ahead and indicate which one you think is a potential stormwater pollutant source that you're going to want to consider, make note of in your assessment.
Okay, the poll is now open. Please select your response and click submit. It looks like the majority of you have responded. Those of you who have not yet responded, please go ahead and submit your responses now, and we will close the poll in a few moments. Okay, the poll is now closed, and we will share the results with everyone.
Okay, so it looks like the majority of you said the outside salt storage shed, and that is correct. Some said the employee parking area and the indoor material storage. So let's go back here real quick. Okay, so when you're doing your initial assessment, I would say look at all of this. But again, remember the purpose of the industrial stormwater permit is to control impacts to stormwater from industrial activities. So you see in A, the salt storage shed, it does have a roof and sides, but you can see really where the materials are bulging on the outside. It's subject to runoff and run on. So that definitely is a potential pollutant source. B, the employee parking area would not necessarily be considered an industrial activity if it strictly is just an employee parking area. But it's something you might want to pay attention to when you're doing your facility walkthroughs, just to make sure, there's no fueling operations or a new industrial activity that pops up. But this, as it is, would not necessarily be considered an industrial activity. And C, the inside storage, they do have some material storage here, but it would not be exposed to stormwater. I don't see any floor drains or drainage structures near there, and it is inside a building. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about your SWIP maps. The maps are a very important part of your SWIP, and you want to take your time and develop good maps. The permit's going to require you to include a general location map and a facility map in your SWIP. In all honesty, you're probably going to need a series of facility maps in order to show the level of detail and have maps that are comprehensive enough and legible enough to be useful for your SWIP team. So just keep that in mind, that you're probably going to need a series of maps to cover everything that you're going to want to cover, including, you're going to want to show your outfalls and your drainage areas, and any relevant information that's going to be needed for inspections, for best management practice evaluations, sampling, and things like that. Your maps, like the rest of your SWIP, are a living document, so consider them as such. So if anything changes, make sure you make those changes and updates to your map and keep them with your SWIP. A little insider SWIP tip here, actually from the stormwater inspection team, is to make sure that you're consistent. If you're between the outfalls as they're identified on your SWIP maps and in your written SWIP document, and the outfalls as you identified them when you put in your notice of intent or your NOI. For example, if your NOI calls out two outfalls, 001 and 002, but an inspector goes out there and looks at your maps and he sees outfall, SWAB and SWB, they're going to question. So just make sure that you have some consistency with your outfalls on your NOI and your outfalls in your written SWIP and on your maps. Okay, some things to consider, some resources. Again, your maps need to be facility specific, but there is some information and resources there to help you. primarily read the industrial stormwater permit. Section 5.1.2 of the permit outlines everything that needs to be included in your maps. And when you look at that, you'll see the list is kind of long. And that's why I say you're probably going to need a series of maps to include it all. If you're trying to stuff everything into one 8.5 by 11 map, it's probably not going to be that usable for the purpose you need it for your SWIP, because it's really not going to be legible, because there's a lot of information that you should include on those maps. Again, start from where you are and what you have. So if you have existing building drawings, drainage, mapping, things like that, consider it and validate the information and incorporate it as necessary. There are also some outside resources that you can use. The USGS is a good source for pulling together that general facility map, which very often is like a topographic map. Some county GIS or county auditors also have some really good base mapping that you can go and have a map kind of printed up, typically for a nominal charge. And if it's not, it can be a base map for your SWIP maps, or it can also just be a base map as you're going through and doing your assessment stage and marking all your information on. So a lot of times that county GIS or county auditor's mapping is useful. And a lot of people will retain a consultant or an engineer to help them pull together their maps, even if they want to write their SWIP themselves. It's not required under the permit, but a lot of people find that useful to get a series of professionally done maps that are usable and comprehensive. And one more thing about mapping, you want to make sure that you look at your particular sector requirements, because some of them, for example, might ask you to specifically call out a fueling operation or something about your industry on the maps. So in order to be in compliance, you want to make sure that you're complying with any particular sector specific requirements they have for mapping. Okay. And again, there's not one way to pull your maps together like anything else in the SWIP, but here's just an example. And in this case, this is probably one of a series of facility maps that show different things. But you can see in this example, they're calling out drainage structures. You get a sense of where stormwater goes. They're calling out outfalls and a sampling port. You also see some areas such as tanks and things, to give you a sense of pollutant sources. So again, just an example. Okay, some common mistakes that people can make when they pull together their SWIPs. We talked about this, but trying to cram everything onto one or two maps. If your maps aren't usable, then you're going to have a harder time complying. Like think when your team goes out, whether they're doing inspections, monitoring, sampling, checking on a BMP, chances are they're not going to take out the 4-inch thick written SWIP binder. They're probably going to take out their record keeping forms and their maps. So I like to tell people, put enough time in the maps that the maps can kind of stand on their own. That it has all the pertinent information that's needed for somebody to really understand what your stormwater story is, where your drainage areas are, your areas of impact, your best management practices, things of that nature. So don't skip on this step. Take your time and develop good maps. Make sure they include all the pertinent information, like your drainage structures. Again, refer to any particular sector requirements that you may have for your industry and make sure that your maps comply with that. Again, I'll say it again, your SWIP is a living, breathing document. Your maps are part of that. They should, periodically review them, make changes as needed, and consider your maps as well as living, breathing documents and keep them with your SWIP. Okay, so at this point, you've gone through a lot of the information gathering phase, understanding stormwater, understanding where it's impacted and where you can pollute it. Now you're taking all that facility specific information and you're saying, okay, based on what I know on my site, what are good measures I can take to reduce or eliminate impacts? Those are known as best management practices, or BMPs. And again, like everything else, this is facility specific, so your control measures need to be set for your particular site. But there are some considerations to kind of help with this. First of all, consider any preventative actions you can take first. Are there steps you can take to eliminate potential stormwater pollutants in the first place? For example, can you move materials indoors to kind of eliminate that potential exposure to stormwater? Can you improve your equipment or maintenance on the site to reduce spills? Can you make any changes to your site to minimize runoff? And therefore, you would minimize the need to have some structural control measures. So all things, start with preventative actions first. And as you go to look at and evaluate your SWIPs, you want to consider a lot of things. They have to make sense for your site. They have to make sense for your stormwater flow. They have to make sense for your pollutants. They have to be feasible. A control measure might be great, but if you don't have the space to install it, it's not going to work for you. Also need to consider your cost. If you don't have the budget to install it as it needs to be installed and maintained, it's not going to work for you. Consider other control measures. And again, you always want to look to any sector-specific requirements you may have and throw that into the fold when you're trying to evaluate your best management practices. Okay, so like every other step we've gone through thus far, this information about your BMPs gets incorporated into your written SWIP document. And again, you're writing kind of a regulatory document, but you're writing it for yourself. So make sure it has enough information to be descriptive and let your team know, tell the story of your site, but don't include information that's not necessary. You definitely want to talk about, identify what your BMPs are, what the nature of your BMPs are, where they're implemented. You want to include in your SWIP any housekeeping and maintenance measures. They're very often a very important control measure. Typically, it's the smaller, easier things that can have a really big impact. So make sure you come up with a good housekeeping plan and include some basic maintenance measures in that written section of your SWIP. You're also going to want to talk about your spill prevention and response because, again, that's an effective control measure, and any erosion and sediment control measures. And again, your maps are a complement to the written SWIP, and typically your maps are what you're going to take out in the field. So you want to make sure all that pertinent BMP information is located on your maps. Common mistakes people can make in their BMPs. Again, not taking the time to think through what makes sense for your facility. You want to make sure they're effective for your pollutants, effective for your stormwater flow. You want to make sure that it's a SWIP or a BMP, if you can put it in, that you can maintain it properly, so it's going to be effective. You want to make sure that all your information about your control measures is sufficiently described in your SWIP and tells that story. And you want to make sure that your SWIP team and anybody else that's responsible for stormwater control on your site understands what your BMPs are and they've been properly trained on what they are and how to maintain them. Okay, so kind of the last phase of you've taken all the information you've gathered, the decisions you've made, and now you're implementing it. You're implementing your SWIP, and you're also showing how you're complying with the stormwater permit, and all of that gets written into the SWIP, and a big part of that is your training. Okay, so again, consider this carefully. You want to make sure that everybody that needs to be trained on the SWIP is trained. So think about anybody that has any involvement in stormwater control in your facility and make sure they're trained. Obviously, your SWIP team, anybody that's responsible for implementing your SWIP, anybody that's involved in installing or maintaining your best management practices or controls, they need to be in the training as well. Anybody that works in an area of industrial activity that's exposed to stormwater, that can have an impact on your stormwater, they should be trained as well. And obviously anybody that's responsible on your team for conducting the inspections, monitoring, and things like that. You want to make sure that they've all been adequately trained and that they understand what their role is in the stormwater control. Some things to consider in your training. Again, think about who's involved in managing stormwater at your facility in any way and make sure that they're included in the training. You don't want to leave anybody out. You want to train, but it needs to be customized for your facility. So you're going to want to talk about what your particular control measures are, what your particular pollutants are. You want to make sure you include the right information. You also want to make sure that you train often, at a minimum once a year. But again, the more you train, the stronger your team, the better job you'll have with complying with the stormwater permit and being in compliance. And not only do you have to train, but remember that you need to document your training and that documentation needs to be part of and kept with your written SWIP document. Okay, just want to talk a little bit about housekeeping. As you do your training, no matter what your topic is, it's always a good recommendation to include some information on housekeeping and common sense practices, because I think, most stormwater inspectors will tell you it's often the really simple stuff that can make a big impact. Things like making sure a dumpster lid is closed, make sure that materials are properly cleaned up. It's just those general housekeeping things that are really important in controlling stormwater on your site. So it's important to kind of weave some of that into your training as you do that. Okay, common mistakes that can be made in training. People don't train at all. They don't include the proper people in the training. They to their facility, so they don't do an adequate training. And if they do the training, they fail to document. So again, you have no proof from a compliance standpoint that you've complied with that training component of the SWIP. So make sure that you keep your documentation. Okay, evaluation and monitoring. Your permit's going to specify what monitoring inspections that you need to do, and your plan to get this done needs to be incorporated into your written SWIP document. And again, some things to consider when you're pulling this piece of your SWIP together. Do your homework. Have an idea of what needs to be done and who's going to do it. That goes back to that SWIP team and assigning, proper roles and tasks to everybody. An important thing to remember, keep your maps updated. If you have good maps, it's going to make this monitoring and inspection that much easier for you, because they're going to take their maps, everything's going to be on there, you're going to know what you have to look at and things of that nature. Make sure your team is properly trained. Again, it all goes back to that preparation stage. And again, you want to do a really good job of describing how you're going to conduct your monitoring inspections in your SWIP. Okay, so in terms of the written part of the SWIP, again, you want to make sure that you have those procedures and monitoring clearly outlined. Again, it's a regulatory document, but it has to make sense for you. So include the appropriate level of information and make sure it's easy to read. Take a look at any other requirements that you have. And again, make sure you include in your SWIP how all this information is going to be documented and kept. Again, there's no one way to pull this together, but this is just an example from a SWIP where they're talking about how the benchmark monitoring is going to be done. So you could see there, they have the dates, the outfalls that are going to be sampled, who's doing it, how the little blurb about the procedure, and what the analysis is going to be for. Okay, so some common mistakes in monitoring and inspection. Again, not taking the time to really think through your plan and write it well and describe it well in your SWIP, not doing the inspections and monitoring, not including all the outfalls and drainage areas. So that goes back to taking your time in those initial assessment phases and pulling all that information together, and not documenting. Even if you're doing all the things right, if you're not documenting, you don't have that compliance proof that you're complying with your SWIP and complying with the permit. Okay, so I just want to touch real briefly on some SWIP housekeeping availability and modifications. So again, I've said many times, your SWIP is a living document. You need to treat it as such. So review it and update it often as needed. So whenever you have a change to a procedure, or you modify a control measure, or somebody in your SWIP team changes, those are all good prompts for you to take another look at your SWIP and to make those changes as needed. And if you have revisions to the SWIP, you're going to want to make those as quickly as you can, or at least put those notations and notes in your SWIP of what needs to be done. Okay, and again, a couple reminders. Anytime you make changes to your SWIP, you want to put that new signed dated certification in there so you know the date that those changes were made, and keep all your information with your SWIP. And another insider inspector tip, make sure you keep a copy of your notice of intent with your SWIP, because that's often another common violation that they're seeing. Okay, it is time for our last poll. So throughout this presentation, we've talked about some mistakes that people can make. And some common violations. So once the poll is launched, what are some common SWIP violations? A, not having a written SWIP document. B, failing to review and modify the SWIP as needed. C, insufficient facility and drainage maps. D, not keeping the documentation with your SWIP. Or E, all of the above. So once the poll is launched, if you could just make your selection.
Okay, the poll is now open. Please select your response and click submit. It looks like the majority of people have responded. We'll keep the poll open for a few more moments. Please submit your response if you have not already done so. The poll is now closed and we will share the results with everyone.
Okay, so it looks like the majority say all of the above, and yes, those are all very common SWIP violations. So hopefully in this session you learned, some pitfalls to avoid. Okay, there we go. Okay, some key takeaways. So again, I've mentioned many times, really, now that you know you kind of have a plan of attack for your SWIP, take your time with each step. Don't rush the process because you'll see the information kind of builds on itself. So if you take the time with each step, you'll have comprehensive information that makes sense for your facility, and you'll be able to pull together a solid SWIP, and it'll make complying with the stormwater permit that much easier for you. Start from what you know, use facility information, but please take advantage of the resources that are there. And there are a lot of resources to help, from SWIP templates to fact sheets that we talked about, as well as some resources that you have there in your handouts. Hire help if you need it. So a lot of people feel comfortable with their level of knowledge to tackle this themselves. Some do not. Some hire, consultants to help with that, or at least part of it, like the mapping. So realize what you need help with and seek out those resources. Again, take time on developing your maps, because your maps in some sense should be good enough to kind of stand on their own, and they'll help your team with compliance. We talked about this, but you're writing a regulatory document per se, but you're writing it for yourself. So you want to make sure it makes sense for your facility, include the appropriate level of information, but don't include unnecessary information to impress an inspector or anybody, because it needs to make sense for your facility in order to be usable. Again, the SWIP's a living document. You want to review it as necessary, and don't forget your documentation, because that's your proof of compliance. So I've included in this presentation a bunch of different resources that you'll also find helpful. For the sake of time and to have time for questions, I won't include them here, but they are available in the presentation. And with that, we'll open it up for some questions.
Great, thank you, Tamara. We're now going to begin answering the questions that were submitted during today's presentation. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. If we do not answer your question during the Q&A portion, we will reach out to you via email following today's webinar. So Tamara, our first question is, does my SWIP have to be submitted to Ohio EPA for review and approval?
No, it does not, unless it is specifically requested by an inspector. But it's important to note you have to have the SWIP, even though you're not required to submit it to an inspector for review and approval. You need to develop that SWIP, and you need to develop it before you submit your notice of intent to get covered under the permit.
Okay. Is there a minimum number of people that a SWIP team needs to have? And going along with that, should you have a SWIP team member across all shifts when your facility is open?
To the first part, the permit doesn't specify a minimum number of people that should be on a SWIP team. But again, every facility is different. So every SWIP team configuration is going to look a little different. I would say you want to have at least a couple people, because it's a heavy lift to pull all that information together and to do the inspections and monitoring. And I would think it would be very difficult for one person to do it. So you're going to want to have several people. But I think it's equally as important to make sure that you have the right people there, because they're your boots on the ground. They're going to help you pull all this information together to write the SWIP, implement it, and ensure compliance. So it's important to have the right people. In terms of having a SWIP team member across all shifts, I don't know. Jason, you have any thoughts on that?
Can you repeat that question? I was typing and not paying attention. Sorry.
Yeah, the question was, do you have to have a SWIP team member across all shifts when your facility is open?
I think as Tamara was saying, the permit doesn't really specify that that's needed, but we've always recommended that folks try to have a team member that would cover each shift of a facility's operations.
Okay, next question. How often does a non-stormwater certification need to be completed?
Okay, Jason, you can correct me on this if I misspeak, but you definitely have to do that non-stormwater evaluation once as part of the SWIP. But I think as you're always doing your facility assessments and your walkthroughs, I think it's something you're always going to want to take a look at, because you're always going to want to get that feedback about your site. Because you could have new activities, things could change. You could have something unforeseen where now you do have a non-stormwater discharge. So I think in terms of the certification, you have to have one certification on your site, but I think it's something you should always take a look at and always be assessing.
And I agree with that. And I'll add one more part to it. And like you said, you need that original certification.
Mm-hmm.
The only time that you would need to, do a official recertification is if your facility has any types of, maybe some, construction that's occurred at your facility. You've had, had some additions added to your facility that would create the potential for maybe any cross connections to your storm sewer system to occur. So that's the only time that the permit would require you to recertify if you've already done that certification, just if you have any major upgrades at your facility.
Okay, thank you. Do I need to hire a professional engineer to prepare my SWIP maps or to certify the SWIP?
You do not. A lot of facilities do choose to hire professionals. So they pull together a set of really comprehensive, legible maps. So again, it goes back to your level of comfort on pulling that information together. But I would recommend whatever is the best way for you to get the best product, because you're really going to want to take your time in developing good maps or a series of maps and have them legible and make sure they include all the appropriate information. Another insider tip from an inspector is having maps in color is often very helpful as well, because it makes them more usable and more legible. But there's no requirement under the permit that you have to have a professional engineer draw up your facility maps.
Okay. For SWIP training, when you host a SWIP training event, do you need to give a quiz, or would a sign-in sheet of the employees that attended be sufficient?
I'm sorry, I missed the beginning part. Do you have to have a...
When you're doing your SWIP training, do you need to give a quiz to the employees that you trained, or would a sign-in sheet be sufficient to show you completed the SWIP training?
You need to document that you did training, what your topics were, the date it was done, and who attended, and keep that with your SWIP. I think testing somebody's knowledge is always a good idea, but I don't believe that it's a requirement under the permit.
The current general industrial stormwater permit expires in a couple of years. Will I have to write a completely new SWIP when I renew coverage under the new general permit?
Okay, that's a great question and a common question. If you've developed a SWIP under the current industrial stormwater permit or a previous iteration, you do not have to reinvent the wheel. But what you do need to do is when you come to that permit within 180 days, you need to look at the new permit, review your SWIP, and make sure that if anything's changed, that you make those modifications or updates to your SWIP so it's in line with the new permit. And I think you have 180 days from the issuance of the new permit in order to review your SWIP and make those changes. But you do not have to start all over, no.
Okay. Could you give a few examples of some quality BMPs that companies commonly implement and have success with at their facilities?
Okay, Jason, you want to take this one?
Sure. And, a lot of times it's, we always try to tell folks, try to use as much common sense as you can. Just, anything that you can move indoors is one of the best practices you can do if possible. Berming, diking, things to maybe so clean stormwater don't, get interacted where different industrial materials are being stored. And one thing I can send out to the entire group is US EPA has developed some really good fact sheets that are industry specific. And for each type of industry, they'll identify what are some common pollutants that this particular type of industry would have, and what are some great BMPs that would be practical for this type of industry to implement. And in the chat thing or the questions, I'll send that out to all links to those documents.
Yeah, in one of the previous slides when we talked about looking at your pollutant sources, that snippet from that US EPA industrial fact sheet was included, and I believe there's a link to one of those slides. And I think it's also in the resources, but you're right, that is a really good resource because they talk about the BMPs that facilities might typically, implement for those particular activities and pollutants.
Great, thank you. It's not always practical to keep a hard copy of the SWIP and all the supporting documents that go along with the SWIP. Is it allowable to keep those documents electronically?
Yeah, the SWIP can get kind of weighty when you have all the supplemental information, including a copy of the permit, maybe a spill control plan, internal measures that you've developed. They need to be readily available. I think if you can keep them electronically, I think that's sufficient. Would you agree, Jason?
Yes, I would completely agree with that.
As long as they're readily available to your SWIP team and to an inspector should they come on your site.
Correct. Yep.
Okay, great. And last question, does my SWIP training need to be a standalone training event, or can I incorporate it into other trainings that I already do?
Yeah, there's no requirement under the permit that the training has to be standalone. The permit requires you to conduct the training. So if it makes sense for your facility to kind of include that in other regulatory training that you're doing, such as RCRA, SBCC, whatever, I think that would be fine. Particularly that might even widen your audience to the people that hear about your stormwater measures. So there's no requirement to have it stand alone. But again, you want to make sure that you do it. You want to make sure that the training is specific to your facility, and you want to make sure that you document. So if you're lumping that in with other training, you want to make sure that you have the documentation for the stormwater components of that training separately and kept with your SWIP.
Great. Okay, well, that's all the questions we have time for. Again, if we have not answered your question, we will be reaching out to you via email after the session ends. Samra, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the session, and we would greatly appreciate it if you would complete that and provide your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email with a link to view a recording of today's webinar, a certificate of attendance, and another link to the survey if you do not get a chance to complete it now. The last session of our 2020 Virtual Compliance Assistance Conference, focusing on spill prevention, control, and countermeasures, or SPCC plans, is this afternoon from 2 o'clock to 3. Please visit our Virtual Compliance Assistance Conference webpage to register for this session and to view recordings of earlier conference sessions that you may have missed. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day.